Through the lens of genre analysis, this video essay will compare how urban legends affect themes in horror films across two different late 20th century geographical contexts: American cinema, with the chosen example of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Japanese cinema, with the example of The Ring. Since the dawn of time, cautionary tales and legends have been passed from generation to generation, warning humanity's children of the dangers that lurk just outside of their parents' sight. These same moral teachings have since been adapted to modern audiences' tastes and have found themselves inhabiting new mediums of art, including our beloved cinema. Although Disney tales of friendship and love offer a substantial moral framework for young viewers, these films become tired and boring after adolescence. The horror genre meets those slightly older, angsty viewers in the middle, offering bucket loads of gore and taboo visuals while serving as modern generation's campfire stories. I am interested in analyzing how this phenomena occurs in different cultures, specifically American versus Japanese cultures. As an aspiring horror filmmaker, I am interested in delving deeper into my favorite genre in order to better understand the moral root at the heart of these films. This will open me up to further self-analyze and form deeper meaning in my work so that my films can become what horror movies have evolved to replace: cautionary tales. Now, to define some key terms. Folklore is a body of popular myth and beliefs relating to a particular place, activity, or group of people, generally spread by word of mouth and oral storytelling. Similarly, urban legends are humorous or horrific stories circulated as though true. Finally, societal fears are common amongst members of a cultural context, driven from a shared source of discomfort and perpetuated by a shared source of media. But why the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Well, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a staple of American horror movies, and because of its setting and connection to classic rural American campfire tales, it's a perfect example to be used in this comparative study. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a film released in 1974 in the United States. The rural parts of the U.S. have long been a source of urban legends and campfire tales. During the 1960s and 70s, amidst a widespread interest and panic in the rise of serial killers, the classic fascination with spooky happenings in the sticks and the killer-caused public anxiety melted together to form the ever-successful teen slasher genre. There's also a heavy focus on being isolated from modernity in this film, which will be touched on later, that stems from societal fears of communes and cults dotting the American countryside during this time. Well, why The Ring? The Ring is not only an incredibly popular and well-made film, but is also a great example of some of the key elements found in folk story-based horror movies from Japan. I also think it's a good film to compare to American horror because of its popularity amongst Western audiences and the success that its sequels and remakes had in the United States. Ring came during a progressive time in Japanese horror, when directors took heavy inspiration from the classical folklore and myth to construct their stories. Traditional Japanese folk horror often revolves around hauntings and revenge, which happens to be the plot of Ring. Along with its classic urban legend warning not to do stupid things with spirits, Ring also reflects its cultural context with its focus on technology. The late 20th century being such a progressive time for technological development and modernization in Japan, the public had a shared sense of fear and anxiety surrounding these new growths and changes. The evil spirit's connection to the corruption of digital technology is a notable cultural context clue, and will be discussed further along in this essay. Now, to get into some similarities between the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Ring. Number 1, both films share stories and foreshadow later events at the beginning of the film. This is an imperative component in effectively delivering the scare in both of these films. It's both vital in building tension and also preys on some of those culturally specific fears that audiences watching might be more prone to. Oftentimes, this is shared in form of a crazy-seeming local spewing what seems like nonsense but later turns out to be true. Number 2, there's also a common sense of isolation within each of these films. Being trapped in a bad situation makes up a majority of the tension. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this might be their rural location and lack of support from those few folks around them. This is as well as their splitting apart the group, causing every battle against this horrific force to be unbalanced. In The Ring, this could be seen as the lack of information and local support that the characters have. They're on their own in breaking the curse. What started as a fun, scary story to share with friends has ended with a curse trapping the protagonist within a mystery with no help of solving it. Both films have a similar cautionary message behind them. Don't disrupt or disobey the order of society. This is emphasized heavily in Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a group of teenagers drive far away into the rural and unprotected parts of the United States. Cautionary tales and urban legends serve to warn kids of leaving their parents' sight, and the sorry fate that follows the independent adolescents proves their warning warranted. For Ring, it's important to understand the origin of the curse. It's from a group of teenagers going out to a cabin against their parents' will and watching a cursed tape. Meddling in things you don't understand, especially paranormal and magical entities, is a common conflict in Japanese folk stories. This message is found across a great deal of other modern horror movies, but can be found in the horror genre as far back as human storytelling in the form of a cautionary children's tale. One of the most noticeable differences between most Western and Eastern horror films is the level of gore. American horror films in particular seem to heavily embrace the use of special effects and gore in their productions, whereas Eastern horror films tend to lean on the psychological and moral fears. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is known for its intense gore and disgust-inducing special effects. In comparison, the only gore found in Ring is a slimy skeleton and a gross lack of fingernails. We can see where these culturally specific scare methods stem from when we look at the level of gore in folk stories from each context. In the United States, the urban legends often climax with intense and overly descriptive gory imagery. This is mirrored in their evolved medium, with special effects being the focus of how the scare is delivered, rather than relying on the unusual or creepy. Like in Japanese horror, tales focus heavily on mystical entities rather than tangible hooked killers and escaped mental patients. This focus lends well to the psychological and creep scare horror that is common in many Japanese horror films. There is a complete lack of personification and humanity within the antagonists in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They're almost subhuman in how demented and evil they are. To connect this to the cultural context of the film, the polarized good versus evil morality was common across the board in most genres of American cinema, at least at the time. Like in Westerns, it was cowboy versus criminal. This is in stark contrast to the careful attention given by the filmmakers of Ring to build a sense of sympathy for the evil entity, going as far as to trick the audience into thinking that the way to break the curse is showing the spirit some love. This is incredibly interesting, as even though the being causing the destruction within the ring was dead and supernatural, they still decided to make the audience look at the horrors from her perspective. For Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even though the characters that were killing the kids were living human beings, there was no level of sympathy built between the audience and the monsters. This sympathy is a common theme in many Japanese folktales, as their themes often revolve around becoming a villain or not becoming the villain. This requires a level of sympathy for the eventually evil being, as stories often follow their descent from being uncorrupted to being an evil person. This influence is seen in Ring clearly, with its protagonists only succeeding in the end by perpetuating the curse and killing more innocent people. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the fear of being without modernity is a large-scope way of viewing the plot. It establishes the isolation of the characters and their lack of connection to the more developed parts of the country. This is eventually their downfall, of course, and this separation from the modern world was a growing fear in the 1960s and 70s in America, with the rise of communal living and hillbilly highway murderers. The fears in Ring are completely opposite, stemming from a fear of technology and its growing influence and possible cursing abilities over teenagers and society as a whole. The ghost strictly communicates through these technological devices, televisions, phones, cameras, corrupting humans through them, a fear of modernity rather than lack thereof. All in all, horror films across all cultural contexts tend to share some key features that draw reactions from our lizard brains, but it is clear to see that the cultural context and folk story inspiration drastically changes the film depending on where it's made. I don't know about you, but I'm incredibly excited to see how the next generation of filmmakers draws inspiration from classic horror tales to turn useful lessons into compelling and unnerving pieces of cinema.